Colin.
Smithy?
It's been a while since we talked. I've been spending that time wisely.
Okay, I'm sorry for not staying in touch.
Forget that. Want a new weapon?
A new weapon? Always!
I'm still working out the kinks. It's a whip.
That sentence was almost oxymoronic.
Shut up, you're an oxymoron.
Well, that's quite rude. I don't resemble an ox in the slightest.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, welcome one and all to another discussion about another weapon that exists in the greater Monster Hunter universe, but not in the main games. I've covered weapons from Frontier, I've talked about the Excel Axe from Explorer, but today we are diving even deeper into the non-canon lore of Monster Hunter with a look at a weapon exclusively used in the Monster Hunter manga, Monster Hunter Orage, which I'm sure I pronounced very, very wrong. This was created by the same artist behind Fairy Tail, so for anyone who didn't know about this, it is actually decent quality. Of course, as you may expect though, the actual Monster Hunter lore details are absolutely all over the place. It plays very fast and loose with what we know monster hunting to be, but there are things like the normal weapons that we're used to all around the place, a bunch of familiar monster faces, and concepts like the guild, star ranks for monsters to describe their difficulty, all of that type of things, just with lots of liberties taken as well. One of the bigger liberties taken is this somewhat shady character literally named Shadow, a weapon engineer who wields a prototype of a brand new weapon, the Hunting Whip. When I say prototype, I really mean it's a prototype because it's at the point where this guy takes a couple of swings and says, well, I probably broke it already, it's not really ready to be used yet. And then he also makes an offhanded comment about not being able to infuse elements into the Hunting Whip yet because it's just so new and untested. So obviously this design needs a lot of work to be a proper functional long-term weapon, even in the manga version that we've seen. But the base description is, imagine a long, sharp sword broken into shards, with a whip running through the middle of the swords to keep the weapon still somewhat connected. Essentially, this is less like a whip as we know them per se, and more like a limp sword that you can swing around like a whip. Obviously, losing some of the stretchy nature of a whip because of all the metal bits, but also gaining bladed edges. So, you know, a bit more menacing of an actual weapon. That said, even this version of the whip is considered less usable for full-on combat than a greatsword, for example, and is much more thought of as a means to capture or control a monster, more or less. The main advantage that this thing really has that makes it properly unique as well is that it is a medium range weapon. It's not an actual sword, and it has some elasticity to the bands that connect the metal segments, and so this weapon can extend much further than any other melee weapon in the series. Of course, however, there is no ammo. You don't throw it, so it isn't quite a ranged weapon either. Now, let's step away from the manga for a second, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about that another day if you guys are interested in it, and let's talk about whether there is any chance of this weapon coming to the main series games one day, and how exactly that could be represented in a fun way that fits the themes of the games already. Firstly, the elephant in the room. Is this a one-handed or two-handed weapon? Well, I mean, by real-world standards, it would weigh quite a bit and logically would need two hands. But this is Monster Hunter, so shut up. Honestly, I think this weapon could easily be a two-mode type of deal. Have a button to switch from one-handed to two-handed mode, sort of like demon mode for dual blades. In two-handed mode, your movement would be heavily reduced. Your strikes would take longer to actually do, the animations would be longer, but you could make the argument that two-handing the weapon gives you the extra strength to increase the range, as the actual whip bits have elasticity to them, meaning the more strength that you swing with in theory, the further that it can technically reach up to its maximum. So with that in mind, I'm considering it as something with two modes. Shorter range, fast hits, really good evasion ability because you just have a free hand, unlike, by the way, every single other Monster Hunter weapon, which is either two-handed or has a shield, so this would need to be seriously mobile in one-handed mode. And then also the two-handed mode. Big, heavy, slow movements, slow attacks, but a greater range. The general animations would very much be like a whip, and you could probably put in a mechanic where the weapon does more damage if the part that it hits to the monster is the very tip of the weapon, like a critical distance type of concept for a melee weapon, where you want to be just on the edge of your range. It would actually make a lot of sense for a whip as well, as when you crack a whip, it is the very tip that has the most energy transferred to it. So hitting something with the end of this weapon should theoretically be simply the strongest option.
Just the tip.
Jane.
And depending on how crazy the developers feel like getting with this thing, they could sort of make it a particularly unique support weapon as well. Given that it is based off of a whip, and whips tend to be good at grabbing things more so than dealing straight up damage to them, I could absolutely see this thing being used a couple of different ways. One, like a false clutch claw, or a half-mounted state, where you get the whip wrapped totally around one body part, hop onto the monster using the whip to keep yourself attached, and then with your offhand you pull out the mounting knife and just go to town on the monster. Alternatively, far more out there, what if the hunting whip could essentially trap the monster momentarily? This is where it becomes more of a support weapon. Imagine if this weapon has its own personal flinch threshold type mechanic, where if you deal enough damage to one specific body part, the whip just grabs on and the monster has to go through an animation to actively get it off. That takes, I don't know, even a couple of seconds to do. It wouldn't do too much for the whip user themselves, but Monster Hunter is very notably a multiplayer franchise, and we already have the hunting horn, which, while quite good solo, is very much at its best and strongest when played with a full group of hunters, because it has mechanics that simply improve the hunting experience for everyone else. So, what if the hunting whip was basically an alternate type of support weapon? Not one that buffs your allies, but essentially debuffs your enemies, creating little half traps to just slow them down that little bit extra, while every other member of the party swings away at them. I could see that working in a really cool way. In fact, let's expand on that even more and make it essentially like a finishing move. Think of zero-sum discharge from Switch Axe, the way that you plunge into a specific monster part, then spam a button for a bit to pump out damage, then a big popping finish. Is it just me, or would a similar mechanic sort of really fit the idea of the hunting whip grabbing a limb? Just imagine that you reach the threshold on a leg, the whip wraps around the leg, you're maybe 10 feet away just because that's how long you can go, and then animation-wise you wind up in a straight-up tug of war with a large monster. It pulls on the whip trying to get you free, you pull on the whip because it's sharp and pulling back does more damage. Button spam during the animation to actually full on tug of war with the monster, every button and every tap is another bit of damage, and you can even give it a big end flourish when the animation ends. Hell, maybe even give the monster a brief flinch animation or a fall over and get back up if you're successful at the tapping buttons really quick to really make it feel satisfying to the hunter. Obviously, the main problem here with the stuff that I've been talking about, with this weapon that I've mentioned, is that it sort of affects other people's hunts a pretty large amount, more than your average Monster Hunter weapon. And, well, honestly, I'm not a game developer. That isn't a secret. I'm just spouting off ideas that I think would make a really fun gameplay experience against Monster Hunter monsters. And I think that there is absolutely some way to make the hunting whip an awesome gameplay experience in a mainline Monster Hunter game. It's worth mentioning that this weapon would probably be super taxing on any sort of physics engine as well, as the only way to make it work properly is to have it actually interact with environments that it collides with the floor, with the walls, with the monster itself, rather than just clipping through it. This is, technologically speaking, an incredibly difficult weapon to bring into the main series as a result. Conceptually, oh, it's easy. It's a badass weapon with tons of ways to expand on that into a full moveset. But in terms of the actual ability to bring this to a mainline game, the actual technological capabilities of the games, this would probably have the most complex animations in the entire game. I don't mean explosions or insane effects of any kind, I mean the actual moment-to-moment animations of swinging the whip around, having to interact with hitting the monster and fling off in a direction that looks correct, rather than just a set recovery animation like a sword bouncing. It would take a lot of doing to actually make function in a satisfying way. As a result, the hunting whip is something that I consider a bit of a pipe dream more than anything. I love the concept. I have a very vivid picture in my head of what this thing could be like inside of an actual Monster Hunter game, but it absolutely could not just just be an afterthought for the game. It wouldn't just be this game has had the hunting whip added on top. It would have to be an integral part of building that game from the ground up, because so many considerations would have to go into how do we make the lobby not break, not physically implode, if 4 hunters are using the hunting whip together and the physics engine just doesn't know what to do, which then arguably would wind up lowering the quality of other parts of the game, especially for people who don't use the whip, just so that the whip doesn't break things for the people that do use it. It is a bit of a mess in that regard. When you think about it that hard, it's sort of hard to implement. That said, if Capcom can make it work, and my worries are completely unfounded, I would be absolutely elated to see this weapon enter the main series games. Hunting Whip would, without a doubt, be one of my most played weapons in the game that it's added in, if it were to be brought to the main series. Alright everyone, I've been Cotton Dinosaur, and this has been a discussion about the Monster Hunter manga. Sort of. Realistically, it was just about the hunting whip itself, but to even know what that thing is and the fact that it exists, you have to read the manga. So yeah. Do you think that the hunting whip would be a welcome addition to the Monster Hunter weapon roster? Do you like my ideas for making it into a functional weapon? Or do you think that you have some much better concepts to lay down in front of me in the comment section below? Like if you like the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world our stage. Goodbye.